I wanted a clock, so I made one. But let's take a few steps back and see where everything started. I started with looking for some inspiration on the web. I found this Palladium studio and they have some great designs. They even made this human-sized clock, which looks awesome. It even has 3D printed clock mechanism. Very nice, check them out. Inspired by their designs, I began creating my own version of the clock. I began with the main body of the clock, adding some hexagonal elements into the design. The wooden part came next, featuring hour marks and a logo that also hides the bolt holding everything together. I also modeled the clock mechanism itself to see how everything fits together. To hide the clock mechanism nut, I designed a pocket between the parts. I also made sure the clock's center of mass sits right in the center.
You sure about that?
Once I was happy with the design, I moved on to the cam stage. Both the main body and the wooden part had features on each side, which meant 2 machining operations per part. The logo and hour marks, however, only required machining from one side. Once everything looked good on the CAD and cam side, it was time to move on to the next step. Before machining, I wanted to prepare the wooden part. For that, I used an oak veneer that's 0.5 millimeters thick, which I plan to glue onto a 2.5 millimeter aluminum sheet. I prepared the aluminum by roughening and cleaning the surface. I used the aluminum sheet as a template and carefully cut the veneer with a utility knife. Lightly sanded the veneer as well. I cleaned the surface with ethanol and paper wipes, removing any grease or dirt. I made a few test pieces using different adhesives, and in the end, I decided to go with a Worth structural polymer adhesive. Whether that was the best choice or not, we'll see. The adhesive was applied to the aluminum and spread as evenly as possible. After placing the veneer, I applied pressure using a tube. Then added some weights on top while everything cured. While the adhesive was curing, I started preparing the CNC machine and the tooling. I made this phone holder bracket and mounted it to the dust chute to get some close-up shots of the machining action. For the camera, I'm using the Blackmagic camera app mainly for the extra control it gives me. Then I started assembling the tools. I already had a few tools set up from previous jobs, so that part went pretty quickly. Once everything was ready, I placed the tools into the machine and assigned them to their correct positions. After that, I selected each tool in the control and let the machine measure the tool lengths automatically. The first thing I machined was the logo, cut from a 1mm black anodized aluminum sheet. I used a 0.8mm ball nose end mill to engrave the logo, cutting just a few tenths of a millimeter deep. For the contour, I used 4mm flat end mill. The first attempt didn't quite work. The text was a bit too large and out of proportions, so I scaled it down and tried again, and this time the result was much better. Then I cut the parts loose from the rest of the material. Here I am sanding off the tabs with a belt sander. Next up were the hour marks. These were cut from a 3mm aluminum sheet. I used a 4mm flat end mill for contour. And for the chamfer, I used 6mm 90-degree chamfer end mill. Once again, I finished them by sanding off the tabs. Now back to the wooden part. A couple of days later, the adhesive had fully cured and the part was ready to be machined. I placed it on the vacuum table, set the work offset and the thickness, and began machining. For the veneer layer, I chose a brand new 4mm flat end mill to reduce tear out, and the results were great. I kept the coolant to a minimum so it wouldn't affect the wood or the adhesive, while also taking light passes to prevent the tool from clogging. Here you can see the pocket for the logo, along with the chamfered hole for the M3 bolt, which holds two main parts together. The smaller holes on the sides are there to allow the logo to be pushed out from the back if needed. And oh boy, look at that fit. Didn't even need a hammer for that one. Let's turn it around for second operation. The second operation is a simple circular pocket for the clock mechanism nut. I wanted to hide it completely from the front side. I'll come back to this part later for the finishing touches. Finally, it's time for the main part of the clock, and also the most challenging one. This part is machined from a 10mm cast aluminum sheet. Cast aluminum is relatively stress-free, which helps prevent warping during machining. The first operation is done on the back side of the clock. I start by machining the pocket for the clock mechanism. Along with an 8mm hole for the shaft. Next, I cut the outer square frame, which allows accurate positioning for the second operation. I also added these 10mm holes to help confirm the part's location on the second operation. After that, I chamfered the edges and engraved my logo, name, location, and the year into the bottom of the pocket. Once that was done, it was time to move on to the second operation. For the second operation, I installed a corner fixture with a known X and Y zero position. This allows me to place the part into the corner, jog the machine to a known location, and set the work offset. I can then check and fine tune the X and Y positions using the 10mm holes from the first operation. Once I'm happy with the alignment, I can continue machining the second and final operation. First, I machine the inner thickness. I used 8mm flat end mill. Followed by the remaining contours and pockets. At this stage, I avoid cutting through the material completely. When the 8mm end mill was finished cutting, I rest machined some sharp corners with 4mm end mill and then with 2mm end mill. Then some holes for the logo and the M3 bolt. After that, I moved on to chamfering the edges. When everything looked good, I slowly cut through the material in stages. I used 4mm flat end mill to cut through the pockets. This helps reduce the risk of the part being pulled off the vacuum table. In the end, the part remains attached to the outer frame using a few tabs. As you can see, it came out really good and there was no issues. Once machining was finished, I cut the part loose from the outer frame. For that, I used a random chisel and a hammer, nothing fancy. After removing the part, I sanded off the tabs with a belt sander and smoothed everything out with an orbital sander. Here I'm deburring the outer edges for a cleaner finish and adding a chamfer to the hole for the M4 thread. Then, a bit more sanding. Next, I tap the M4 hole. To make the screw fit inside the logo pocket, I had to turn down the outer diameter and grind the head slightly thinner. Now it fits very nicely. For the oak veneer, I used a teak furniture oil. It protects the wood from moisture and oils while giving it a smooth, matte finish.
Nice.
I applied a couple of coats, sanding lightly between each one. Then it was time to paint the hour marks. To hold the small parts, I used a scrap aluminum strip and a bit of blue tack. I started with a Motip 1K epoxy primer followed by matte black and finished everything off with a clear coat. In the meantime, the main body was powder coated in black with a slight texture. And yeah, it looks awesome. There are still some machining marks visible at the bottom of the pockets, but once everything is assembled, they won't be seen. Once all the parts had fully dried, it was finally time to assemble everything. I started by installing the hour marks onto the wooden part. They fit perfectly. No glue, no hammer required. Next, I bolted on the clock mechanism. It goes together with a metal hook, a rubber washer, a metal washer, and a nut. I tightened it with an 11mm wrench and made sure everything was straight. Then it was time to fit the wooden part. It is screwed down with previously mentioned bolts. I tightened it down with an Allen key. And finally, pressed the logo into place. Once everything looked good, it was time to head back home to install the hour and minute hands, and finally hang it on the wall. Yeah, something's not right.
What?
Turns out I messed up somewhere. The center of mass was completely off. So I jumped back into Fusion to figure out what went wrong. And of course, the problem was in the physical material settings for the wooden part. Once I fixed that, the real center of mass finally made sense. The first thing I tried was making the wooden part thinner and lighter. That helped a bit. Then I added these additional wooden pieces. That helped a bit more. After that, I added a few extra copper weights. Now everything finally looks balanced. So it was time to get back to machining. I drilled small holes behind the hour marks so I could push them out from the back. Once they were removed, I placed the part back on the machine and continued machining. After that, I cut out the wooden pieces. I found a piece of copper bar, traced the shape on it, and roughly milled it to size on the manual mill. Then I glued all the pieces together and mounted them onto the clock. Now it's balanced. And it finally looks right. With that done, it was time for the final steps. I installed the hands, added the battery, set the time, and hung it on the wall. I like how close it sits to the wall. It keeps the whole design nice and minimal. That's it for this video. See you in the next one.